Warning, there's a new study out about the dangers of eating butter. It's been published in a prestigious journal. Here is an article from Newsday. Butter can shorten your life.
Is butter dangerous? Does eating butter lead to an early death? Hi, I'm Dr. Eric Westman, and welcome to my channel where I review and debunk nutritional misinformation online. Yet another study in the headlines that butter is bad and saturated fat will kill you. And we're going to go through this paper with Dr. Ken Berry. Dr. Ken Berry is going to do the hard work of doing a critical appraisal or evidence-based medicine review of this current study that's made the news. Be sure to listen to the end where you hear my final comments. Before we jump into today's video, I would like to invite you to join my free course, Start Keto Right. If you're ready to lose weight, boost your energy, and get real results, this science-backed method will help you every step of the way. No guesswork, just a proven method to help you succeed on keto faster and feel amazing. Sign up through the link in the description.
Eating butter, it's been published in a prestigious journal. We're going to break this study down and I'm going to help you understand, is this real? Is this real science? Should you actually not eat a fat that humans have been eating for thousands of years and replace it with fats that humans have only been eating for hundreds of years? I'm Dr. Ken Berry, a family physician. I've been studying medicine and nutrition for over a decade now. Let's dig into this. So you've probably seen the news reports. Let me pull up a few articles here to give you an example. Here is an article from Newsday. Butter can shorten your life, increase cancer risk. Study finds. So their wording here obviously implies causation. Butter can shorten your life.
So, of course, always consider the source. And here, Dr. Berry is the reviewer of the article, but we're actually going to get into the details of the articles. And here, yeah, the media really have no filter for you to be able to filter out the noise in research articles. We've gone through that before, where animal studies get through this filter, mice studies, and you think it applies to you when you really can't make that assumption. So here, you know, Dr. Berry is going to be doing a really good job of critical appraisal here. So yes, he's a family physician in Tennessee, but this is a pretty solid critical appraisal review.
No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Here's another study or another article from Fortune magazine. They have a wellness section. I'm not sure why they don't just stick to money and finance. The title says, just one simple dietary change could help you fight back against cancer and heart disease. Sounds pretty clear cut. Here's an article from NBC News, a bastion of real news. Eating less butter may improve health, protect against heart disease and cancer. At least they included the word may. I have to give them credit for that. So here is the actual study published in JAMA, Internal Medicine. This is one of the journals of the American Medical Association, who people used to have a lot of respect for. The title is Butter and Plant Oils Intake and Mortality. So now a good friend of mine and a colleague, Dr. Gil Carvalho, has already done a video about this study. And I consider Dr. Carvalho, who's an MD, PhD, I consider him a friend and a colleague. I've been on his channel before. I greatly disagree with his dietary recommendations that he gives to people, but I think he comes from a place of a good heart, and he's truly earnest and honest in his beliefs. He tries very hard to make this study important, to make it actually mean something.
Well, so to start off, you know, it's not just the journal that the article's in. Where did the article come from? You know, who are the investigators? And so maybe we could be critical of this article because of the, unknown investigators that it comes from. And I'm borrowing a little sarcasm from Dr. Barry here. You have to get used to, if this is your first time hearing him, he'll use a lot of sarcasm, and it doesn't work well in the doctor's office. I understand. But so, well, this is from the Harvard School of Public Health. And the Harvard School of Public Health for years has been publishing nutritional epidemiology. We're going to hear the critique of it. And, I didn't even want to print out the entire paper. It's just not worth it, is my summary of my impression of this. But let's go through, if you want to become a critical appraisal aficionado, we're going to learn some of the details of why this really doesn't apply to my daily life or yours.
And I'm about to give you the step-by-step breakdown of why this study is junk science. And I put the word science in air quotes because this study, it doesn't actually tell you anything. And I've got a summary here. I want to go over this with you and step-by-step tell you why this study means nothing. So first of all, the study design. This is an observational study, which Dr. Carvalho says that, and he gives the weaknesses. There are many weaknesses of an observational study.
Right. Well, to boil it down, observational studies are hypothesis generating. I mean, you could come up with an idea. They're not hypothesis testing. They can't be. So, well, take that back. Well, no, what's confusing about this is if the association is astronomically high, like for lung cancer and cigarette smoking, no one ever did the hypothesis testing study for lung cancer and smoking, where they randomized people to smoking or not smoking. So there is some argument that observational studies have merit if the association is really high. But in nutritional epidemiology, the associations are never really very high. And one reason you can see that is that there are hundreds of thousands of people in the study, which you might think, oh, what a great study. Well, but if the associations are that small and with that many people, actually that leads to the idea that it's not real, or that it really has to go through hypothesis testing or experimental research. But yeah, here are all the limitations of observational studies.
It's a prospective cohort study. It cannot ever establish causation. So when you see a news article headline that says butter causes or butter can lead to, that's poor reporting on its face. Right off the bat, you can ignore that article. They don't even understand the basics of epidemiology. So it's an observational study design. Number two, self-reported dietary intake. The food frequency questionnaires that they use are given every 4 years. And they ask questions like, how many rashers of bacon do you eat a week? And so most people can guesstimate that, but some of the questions on these food frequency questionnaires are very prone to recall bias. This is well known in the epidemiological literature. There have been studies showing that food frequency questionnaires often lead to either underestimation or overestimation of consumption. These are cumulative dietary averages. The study calculated cumulative averages of butter and plant-based oil intake, which may not accurately reflect participants' actual dietary habits over time. So what we want in medicine and in nutrition and in science in general is we want actual data. We want actual facts that we can then crunch the numbers on and figure out, is this really a problem or not? In an observational prospective cohort study like that, there's no randomization. The patients were not randomized. This increases the risk of confounding. This is well known in observational research. Now, the confounding variables, there's the potential for residual confounding, despite adjusting for multiple confounders, including BMI, smoking, alcohol, and physical activity. Now, when they say adjusting, so we adjusted for obesity, realize this is a mathematical formula. This is a a computer model. They can never truly adjust for BMI or smoking or alcohol or physical activity. All they can do is just a good faith effort to try to adjust for that.
Yeah, and that's getting into the statistical weeds a little bit, but it's important that the hypothesis generating research, if it's not your initial question, that you isolate the variable and then you can randomize people. And randomization is just a bias reducing feature. It's not the only way to get knowledge, to have randomized trials, of course. But so basically Dr. Berry is going through the textbook of these are all the limitations of observational studies.
Very important to understand. Also, healthy user bias. People who are trying to be healthy, who don't smoke, who don't drink, who try to be active and exercise, they've been trained by the mainstream media. The articles I just showed you at the beginning of this video, they've been trained to think, oh, if I want to be healthy, I need to avoid saturated fat. I need to avoid butter and lard and bacon grease and other things. So you get these healthy people who are jogging and who are lifting weights and who are trying to maximize sleep. And then on the other side, the people who are eating the most butter and the most bacon and the most beef are very often people who don't give a damn about their health. They're just eating whatever, smoking whatever, drinking whatever. They don't care. So you get this baked in the cake healthy user bias anytime you do a study like this, and it's impossible to adjust for this. Socioeconomic factors are not fully controlled, meaning that there people of lower socioeconomic status tend to just eat whatever. They don't have access to all the information somebody in the top 10% of the income has. They don't have access to a personal chef or to a nutritionist on call for them, or they don't have 5 refrigerators and 3 freezers that they can keep all this healthy food in. They're just doing the best that they can. And then dairy intake and butter consumption was not fully differentiated. The study lumps butter consumption together, but does not account for differences in dairy product consumption patterns. Also very, very important. Now, there was a lack of control over dietary components. This study did not isolate butter and plant-based oil intake from the rest of the diet.
Yeah, it's the gist of these details are that it's difficult to measure what people are eating at home, especially to know what they're eating if you just ask them every 4 years. And that, to me, is one of the fatal flaws of nutritional epidemiology or epidemiology of any kind. If you only measure something every 4 years, what if people change? What if the changes here they're looking at cumulative intake of it? The other fatal flaw is that so the healthier people eat a certain way. It doesn't mean that if the unhealthy people ate that way, they would be healthy. What if these are the people who had diabetes and other metabolic issues? So really, even if all of the measurements were true, just because someone eats that way and they're healthier doesn't mean that the other people, if they eat the way healthy people eat, will become healthy. What if they have diabetes and they can't eat the sugar and the soda and other things that the healthy people can? So that's one of the fatal flaws of nutritional epidemiology. And let's keep going with the detail here.
It makes it very difficult to determine if there's any direct effect. Plant-based oils were grouped together. So in this study, they grouped olive oil, canola, soybean, corn oil, safflower, vegetable shortening. They lumped all these things together. So again, this is not even real data. These are not even true facts that we can then do a study about. There was no differentiation between cooking and uncooked oil use. We know for a fact that if you cook at high temperatures with soybean, canola, vegetable shortening, that it causes oxidation, and that can cause inflammation in the body. This was not accounted for in this study at all. Also, there was a complete lack of looking at or talking about the industrial processing that has to be done on soybean, corn oil, canola, and other vegetable oils. They have to refine it, they have to bleach it, they have to deodorize it, which can, it's been shown that it can induce pro-inflammatory compounds into the oil. None of this was taken into account.
Now, in the defense of epidemiology, and I'm a master's level biostatistician, I took clinical epidemiology coursework and master's in biometry, it's called, from Duke University, the clinical trial research program. And in defense of epidemiology, they'll say that, well, yes, we didn't really measure things perfectly. But there's something called non-differential misclassification bias. Bias is toward the null. You can look this up. It means that if it's all kind of blurry, it means that there shouldn't really be any relationship. That means biasing toward the null or 1 or 0, no relationship at all. So that despite all of the imperfections in the measurements here, if there wasn't a relationship, it would be 0 or 1. 1 in this case, hazard ratio. Well, non-differential misclassification bias would mean that there would be no relationship or a very small one. And in fact, that's what we're going to see here. Even with that, if there was misclassification, there really isn't a relationship here, but let's keep going.
The cause of death classification was determined by death certificates. Now, being a doctor for 22 years, I've had to fill out hundreds and hundreds of death certificates. And I can tell you, this is one of the least favorite things that a doctor can do. Doctors don't enjoy doing this. We don't get paid to fill out death certificates. So most doctors half-ass this. They're like, I don't.
Well, or the residents in the hospital are asked to do it, the trainees.
I don't know. There was no autopsy. I don't know what really killed this person. So I'll just say heart disease, or I'll just say acute myocardial infarction. Even if there's no evidence of that, death certificates are a terrible, terrible way of gleaning what actually killed a person. And I know if you're not in the medical field, you may be saying, wait, what? Death certificates? Doctors just half-ass that? Yes, all the time.
Yeah, so in clinical trials that have, good funding to verify the death and then also verify the cause of death, we'll actually poke around and try to get proof of the death certificate or the cause of death. You might have death, but then was it a cardiovascular death? Was it a cancer death? So these are all things that need some sort of adjudication beyond just a death certificate, for sure.
The state death offices are constantly yelling at doctors because doctors will just put heart disease, and you can't do that. They send it back and say, no, you have to be more specific. And very often I can remember in hundreds of situations where I'm like, this person died at home. The family found them 3 days later. They didn't have an autopsy. They're now in the ground, because you typically don't get the death certificate for a week or two after the person dies. I'm like, how can I possibly know? So I made something up, just like every other doctor does. They made all kinds of cancer and cardiovascular mortality assumptions. The study assumes a direct link between butter and cancer mortality, but does not provide a plausible mechanistic explanation. We've been eating butter and lard and beef tallow for thousands of years. Tell me a mechanistic explanation of how it's now suddenly bad for us. There's no subgroup analysis of omega-6 versus omega-3 ratios. That's also very important. Now, here's a big one, the statistical limitations of this study. The hazard ratios are very small. The hazard ratio for butter is 1.15.
1.15. To put that into context, you can say that's a 15% increase, which sounds like a lot. This is similar to the absolute risk reduction and relative risk reduction that we see in randomized trials of medication for cholesterol, for example. So you want to be sure, that the rate or the risk, the absolute risk and the relative risk are presented in this study. Here we just have the relative risk of 1.15. Nobody really knows what number makes it plausible or clinically relevant, but the higher the number, the more likely the association in these association studies for cancer and lung disease, smoking and COPD and smoking. The relative risk hazard ratios were about 10 or 12 to 1, not 1.15. And so it was 120%, not 15% in these cases. So we're looking at very small associations. Now, the defense of nutritional epidemiology, those folks will say, well, we really don't see anything bigger than 2 or 1.8 or 1.5. And, I say, well, that's not good enough. So, just because that's the best you can do doesn't mean it's relevant to human health and to clinical relevance. So I agree this is a really small hazard ratio, which is typical for these kinds of association studies. It makes it more underwhelming.
So a hazard ratio of 1.0 means there's no risk. So this is literally a tiny possible risk with butter. And then the hazard ratio for plant-based oils is 0.84. Again, this is a very tiny statistical difference. It suggests a very weak association. And it may not be clinically significant at all. And I opine it's not clinically significant. My colleague who believes in a plant-based diet would say, oh, I think it is. But that's just two opinions. And you know what an opinion is worth. Multiple comparisons without adjustment. There are many subgroup analysis increasing the risk of false positive findings.
Yeah, and that one's kind of a deep dive into statistics where we use an arbitrary cut point for statistical significance of 0.05. It's arbitrary. If the statistics is 0.001, it's less likely to be due to chance. But then the clinical significance is entirely different. You could have a very statistically significant finding here, even though the P was for trend, meaning it wasn't that large. But even if it was, statistical significance does not mean that it has clinical relevance or clinical significance. And the multiple comparisons idea is that if you use a P of 0.05, that basically you're thinking about one test. We'll do one comparison. But if we do two comparisons, the strict rule would be to do 0.05 divided by 2. Or if we did 100 comparisons, we would use 0.05 divided by 100 for the level of statistical significance. So there are ways to do adjustments of the p-values if you have a lot of comparisons. Ideally, you would have an experimental trial with one comparison that you want to do, which is the experimental manipulation you did, and then you use a p of 0.05, two-tailed, because you don't know if it's going to be up or down. And all of these kind of statistics, I think, are not necessary to know really. The big picture here is that it's observational research. You can't have causation determined by observational research.
So also this was actually performed in a study that's been going on for decades. And it's done in predominantly white healthcare professionals. Okay. There was a doctor study and a nurse's study. So these results, are they applicable to poor Hispanics? Are they applicable to poor African Americans? The vast majority of people in this study are upper middle class white men and women, in depending on if you're talking about the doctor study or the nurse's study. How applicable is that to poorer populations or to other ethnic populations? I think that's a very valid question. This all comes from data that was collected as early as 1990. And remember, the food frequency questionnaires were given only one time every 4 years. And some of this data is coming from the 1990s. Yet when you look at these articles that were just put out, this is 2025. You're like, oh, this is new research. No, this is not new research. This is research from the 1990s and from the 2000s.
And you might say, why does that matter? Well, we look at things differently. Through what lens do we look at things? And if you're categorizing foods in certain ways, you can lump together, say, a hamburger, and it becomes a high saturated fat food when it also contains carbohydrate, the bun. So a lot of these foods are categorized in ways that are filtered through the lens of what we think are good and bad. Of course, we have a saying in the low carb keto world that don't blame the burger for what the bun did, for type 2 diabetes, because the burger doesn't raise the blood sugar, but the bun or the bread will. So I think that is important, in that the way we collect the data will change over time, and you want to limit, if you can, the bias of how we look at the information that's presented to us. It's not easy to do.
And from the 20 teens Also, funding and research affiliation. Some of the authors are affiliated with institutions and organizations that have historically promoted plant-based dietary patterns, such as Harvard's Chan School of Public Health, which may introduce bias in the interpretation. And that's one of the biggest hamstrings, one of the biggest Achilles heels of observational data when it's done by someone like the Chan School of Public Health at Harvard. There's no blinding. There's no randomization. So it's very easy for the researchers' preconceived notions, what they believe to be true. It's super easy for that to filter into the results of the data.
Yeah, and it may be done not explicitly. It may not be that they're trying to find this association, although if you believe that saturated fat is bad, you may make certain decisions in how to calculate and categorize that information, like the burger and the bun. So yeah, it's not easy to be unbiased. It's almost as if it's one of those personality ink blot pictures where you can see what you want to see in that kind of data, because it's kind of blurry.
So as we go on this journey together, trying to rediscover a proper human diet, keep in mind, every time you see a new headline like this, 99% of the time, it is based on a observational study that has very, very weak hazard ratios, that was performed by researchers who believe in a plant-based diet. This is not randomized, controlled, blinded research. This research, first of all, proves nothing. But then when you start to dig into this study, you're like, what the hell? This is worse than worthless. And if you come to that conclusion, then I agree with you. And I think you're right. I think these kind of research studies are worse than worthless. The only thing that this study could help us with is, okay, well, maybe there's something here. Maybe we need to do further research in a more controlled fashion, and maybe a more blinded fashion, so that we can actually get some findings that could actually imply, if not show, causation. But this study, my friends, this study ain't it at all. So as we continue to go down this road together of learning, rediscovering what is a proper human diet, this kind of research is really not helpful at all. In my opinion, if you're watching this and you're like, well, I was thinking about doing a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet, but I just saw this study about butter. In my opinion, your results, if you said, okay, screw this butter study, I'm gonna go keto or carnivore or ketovore or do the lion diet. I'm gonna do it for 90 days. At the end of that 90 days, your results, how much weight you lost, how much your lab markers improved, how much better you feel, how much better you look. In my opinion, your data that you're going to collect on your 90-day journey of rediscovering a proper human diet is much more valuable to you than the data, the pseudo data, the sort of data that comes from a bullshit study like this one that we've highlighted today.
Well, Dr. Berry doesn't mince words, but he's got a point where your own experience is very valuable, and it's couched that with nutritional epidemiology we're able to see down the road and see what would happen if lots of people ate a certain way. And even the low-carb keto world is not represented in this research, and we've seen papers where they're trying to look at low-carb or keto diets, and there just aren't people who are doing it to any degree. And so they're making assumptions that if your diet's under 30% carbs, that it's a keto or carnivore kind of diet, and that's not a good assumption because the metabolism is entirely different. So in this study, it's not definitive at all. And yet, when I'm now faced with nutritional epidemiology, I wonder what the PURE study shows. So now there are two major nutritional epidemiology studies, which gives me a conundrum, because do I do two wrongs make a right? When the PURE study from McMaster, which is one of the statistical workhorses of the world, what if they find something that's entirely different? And so here in the Lancet This is Dr. Dagon from the McMaster study, the PURE study, and basically they found no relationship between the fat intake and mortality. Well, no, in fact, the total fat and individual types of fat were related to lower total mortality. So we have one nutritional epidemiology group saying one thing, another group saying another. The McMaster group, I think, collects information in a very different way. It's a newer sort of look, and it's a different group. It's an international sort of data. So there are reasons why they might find different results, but if it's such a strong finding that fat will kill you, they probably would find it in their nutritional epidemiology research, and they're not finding the same thing. When Andrew Menti, one of the investigators at McMaster, started speaking at the Keto meetings some years ago, basically finding that carbs were causing diabetes and fat was not causing harm, he was invited to speak at our meetings, because that's what we notice in our clinical practices, and now the science is bearing that out, that the old paradigm had a certain view, and it's not the only view, and there's a new paradigm where fat is not causing higher mortality and carbs are causing diabetes because they raise the blood sugar. Kind of makes sense. So I'm torn because I'll say nutrition epidemiology, we shouldn't really trust it, and yet there's one that kind of has my bias view, the other doesn't, and no, still we need prospective science. So it's a start. Nutritional epidemiology is, repeat after me, nutritional epidemiology is hypothesis generating research, not hypothesis testing research. This study has been overblown, overrepresented because I think of the echo chamber and confirmation bias. People believe saturated fat and butter are harmful. The researchers of saturated fat many years ago put together a scientific paper basically saying saturated fat is not a concern for heart disease. It just takes years and years for that to percolate through other organizations. I thought Dr. Berry did a great job of reviewing this article. The article itself is just another example of nutritional epidemiology that has lots of flaws, and I didn't think it persuaded me. Shouldn't change your view or change what you eat as a result of it. If you like, please like and subscribe and ring the notification bell. Be sure to look out for new content on Wednesdays and Fridays. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.